Wow, we had some technical difficulties getting started there, guys. Sorry about the late start. The problem is whenever we have a guest on, if they have an Apple computer, Safari hates StreamYard for some reason. So
Mhm.
Dr. Lavoie had a little trouble getting connected with us, but you guys know the routine. We typically ask everybody to please like, subscribe, go check out our locals. We're going to have a conversation with Dr. Lavoie tonight about his book. And then Rob and I will probably do a little segment for our locals supporters afterward. But to begin with, Dr. Lavoie, it is welcome to our show. Rob had suggested getting you on. He read your book and he thought it was phenomenal. A couple of things about it, and we were just wondering what even got you interested in starting to research the Shroud.
Well, it was, we may say it was by accident. I was a freshman at Boston College. I was in pre-med, and I remember going down into Boston, came into this old bookstore and found this book called A Doctor at Calvary by Dr. Pierre Barbet. He was a French surgeon, and I thought he was really just simply going to talk about the crucifixion of Jesus, but I read the book, and then for the first time in my life, I heard about the Shroud of Turin, which I never heard about before. I was fascinated by it, but put it aside. And the next time I saw it was like 17, 18 years later. I'm just starting my practice in internal medicine in Boston. I opened up the Boston Globe, and there's a picture of the Shroud of Turin. It was 1978, and it says they're going to have an exhibit on it. It's the first time they were having an exhibit since 1933, so it's really quite a thing. And so I started to look into it and just talk to my wife, and we decided to go. I was very fortunate because I met, there was a big scientific study that was being done there in 1978 by about 50 Americans. I got involved. One of the priests, Father Peter Rinaldi, was very helpful. He was sort of the man behind the scene. He introduced me to all these people. Some of them have become lifelong friends. Um, I also got a chance to take photographs, and I went to their a conference that they had at that time. However, I'll tell you, when I get back, I really didn't need the shroud for my faith, and I was still a skeptic, but I started to look at the cloth, and I just decided, well, I'll look at one of these. It was a blood mark that was very interesting to me because it was an off-image blood mark, off the elbow, and no one knew how that got there. So I was fascinated by it, worked on it a while, and then I was very fortunate. I had a friend of mine who purchased the full size copy of the Shroud, with photograph, of course. And one day I decided to put that over myself, and then I discovered where that blood mark came from, and with that I realized that indeed there was a crucified man that was placed in this cloth, and that started me off. And then I went from there, but always a skeptic, in a sense. And being a skeptic was very good because I discovered a lot of things, because I questioned a lot of things, and as I questioned these things, I got answers, and those answers were the right answers rather than a forger doing it, and so forth. And then I also seeked anybody that said it was a fake, and and they were reputable in any way. I would seek them out, and I would go to their lectures or whatever. And every time I did, I found that they really didn't have great data. And so here I am.
We interviewed Barry Schwartz on Tuesday. He was one of the photographers on the project, and he it what most people found interesting is that Barry actually never converted or anything, but he truly does believe it's the burial cloth of Jesus, so which is an interesting thing, that a guy could say this is what it claims to be, but he's not affected by it. So where were you in your life of faith when you get this opportunity to go and see it?
Well, I think I know Barry. He's a great guy. He's done a wonderful job with shroudphotos.com. A tremendous amount of work he's done, putting uh, bringing a lot of information to the public. which I just think is terrific. And he's a great guy. I've known him for many, many years. Um, but my situation was this: I had my faith, and I didn't need the Shroud of Turin for
Yeah.
my. I didn't care what it was. I was only interested in the truth about it. And so, as I told you, as I mentioned to you, I was such a skeptic that I really didn't want to perpetrate a fraud. That was about the
Yeah.
last thing to do. And there was, when I wrote my first book, was about 25 years ago. I mean, I was practically at the end, and I'll tell you, I would have tossed the whole thing out if I thought in any time, in any way, there was a fraud here. So anyway, that's a good thing because it was something I didn't need or want. I I could have, like I said, tossed it out anytime.
Yeah.
That's how I stood and
Um,
stand.
so, in your opinion, what are some of the most compelling pieces of evidence that say this is a genuine, that it is what it claims to be? Like, is there anything that's, because when we spoke to Barry, we didn't really get into all the details. We just kind of went through what the testing was and the things like that. Like, what are the most compelling pieces of evidence to say that this actually is what it claims to be?
Well, there's a lot of compelling evidence. I mean, it's from where you go. I think for your audience, for some of the people in your audience, maybe they all know exactly what the Shroud of Turin is, but a few people out there may not. But it's anyway, it's a cloth that's 14 feet long, 3.5 feet wide, has a very faint image of the front and back of a naked man, and it has all these blood marks on it, and all of them are consistent with uh, the the burial, the passion and burial of Jesus, as we read in the Gospel of John. Uh, and there's some parallel marks that are brown marks across the shroud as well. Those are burn marks from 1532. It's made of flax and linen, and so that's just the basics. If you have to have a picture of that, that would be great. Uh, but anyway, we can go from there. I think the most important thing is to realize that on this cloth that there are two events that occurred. One of them was the blood marks, uh, definitely from a crucified man. I've made presentations of this for like 45 years to physicians and everyone, and the forensics of the crucifixion of this, when you show it, I have never had in all those years anybody come back to me and say, well, you really believe it's a crucified man? Because the evidence is so powerful. There's no question.
Yeah. What
So,
what what from your perspective, what are some of the things that you found that you thought weren't being discussed? Like, so what made you even write a book? Was there things that you saw that nobody else saw?
right, I did a lot of my own work. There's a lot of books that are written that are, people are become very interested in the shroud, and they gather all the different, the materials and so forth on it, and then they put it all together. In my case, of course, I gather materials that are what I think are very, very important. And in the book, I have a full chapter on what happened with the STIRP team. And I was very fortunate. I interviewed a number of those guys, and the whole thing, including, and I became very friendly with other people who were involved, like Al Adler, who discovered there was blood on this cloth. He and I talked for years, sometimes 3 hours at a time, discussing this cloth. And then, so it really, there's so much there. So I've got all that information in there that I think is most pertinent with regard to the science from the point of view of looking at the cloth itself. And I think it's worthwhile going over a couple of those things. One of them is the fact Al Adler was a chemist, and he was an expert in porphyrins. And hemoglobin breaks down, and it breaks it down into porphyrins. And he's the man that discovered, indeed, that there was blood on this cloth. And then when you look at this cloth from gross level, you can see that some of this blood actually sinks into the cloth. And if you look at under let's say 32 times magnification, you can see the topmost areas have been abraded off, but it actually sinks into the weave and around into the area. So it's really there. So we have, and it's really blood. And again, it's really blood. All the forensics and so forth tell us it's really the blood of a man who was crucified. The other the other piece of it for your for the audience is really the image itself. That is absolutely unique in the whole world. Just take a thread of the shroud itself, and it's made up of many fibers, and those fibers are way less. The diameters of those fibers are way less than the hairs on your head, and the what why we see the image is the yellowing of fibers like that, and it is very superficial. Now I said that it's less than the weight lower than the diameters of the hairs on your head, and those fibers are only 1 to 2 fibers deep with regard to seeing the shroud. It's incredible.
Yeah.
There's no way that could be a painting, and plus the fact that Adler as well did a lot of chemical studies, and there's no paint, dye, or stain on there. And what can cause the yellowing is caused by a dehydrative oxidation, which is really a degradation of linen. You be at your grandmother's, and she'll have a linen cloth, and there's a pot on there, and you pick up the pot, and you see it's white in the middle, and it's sort of yellow around. That's the degradation of the material, and acid, heat, and light can do that. But the shroud itself has never been reproduced at that microscopic level.
One of the most interesting things I found about the shroud, and we talked about it a little bit with Barry, was that the image itself doesn't appear as though it was wrapped around his body. It's almost as if the shroud was pulled taut, and it's not like it's pressed against his body where there's like I don't know how you'd say it, like a smudging of the image or anything. It almost seems like that the cloth itself was pulled tight as the image was made, and I heard there was a particle physicist saying that it was almost as if there was no gravity in the tomb when this image was created.
Right. So that thought is something that I did many years ago, and brought that to into the scientific world with regard to. I did a study back in the 80s regarding you saw blood. What I was looking at the blood on the hair, and I had this picture across across my desk in my practice, and I wondered if that blood went out too far. I don't know. So I took it home, and I did um, a cutout of that blood, and then placed it on a volunteer's face, and then we painted in those cutouts, and we discovered, without any question, that the blood did not originate from the hair, but the blood originated from the face. So, in other words, it was on the temples and cheeks of the man of the shroud. The blood was not on the face per se. It was, it was on the face per se, and the cloth actually was placed and covered around the sides of the face. It also covered around the sides of the body, because the blood mark that I was interested in was the blood mark off the left elbow, and that shows that not only that. I'll get back to that in a minute, but let's talk about the blood on the face. So what happens is that you get, it seems that the cloth, and this is what I would say, it seems as if the cloth was stretched out, and the blood, the image, the negative image, got onto the cloth with the cloth actually stretched out, and therefore because it was stretched out, it looks like it's out in the hair, but actually those blood marks actually were on the sides of his face. So,
Gotcha.
so that study is in my book, The Shroud of Jesus, published by Sophia Press, and it's a fascinating study. It's gone around the world, and nobody has really an answer to it. And of course, this concept of a cloth being stretched out comes from that. This is not just this. you can see this physically, and I have the photographs and everything in my book. I have about 80 photographs in my book, and I got all those photographs from Vernon Miller, who was the official photographer, scientific photographer of the STIRP group, and all those, and he and I were great friends, and he so anyway, you can people, and the other thing that I do is that anything that I talk about, people can see. I have photographs for everything. So what I say, you can see it, and then you can make up your mind whether you think it's real or not.
Yeah.
That's where I'm at.
So one of the most interesting things that me and Rob were talking about on your book is how you kind of have this theory that St. John is giving us little glimpses and hints that he has the shroud throughout the Gospel of John, right?
Yeah, it's not a theory. It's just what's there. It's not a theory. It's there.
Yeah.
I've had many scholars, basically look at that. Scott Hahn, Mike Aquilina, Jürgen Leas, uh, Father Rocky from Relevant Radio. They've endorsed my book. They've looked at that, and in other words, from the point of view, because what it is that uh, I don't like dealing in theories. I just deal in fact.
Yeah.
I'm a fact guy. I'm a physician. When I go to a patient's bedside, I deal with facts. I can't deal with theories. So what do we have in the book? I'm not dealing with theories. I'm dealing with facts. People can, again, look at it and say, well, is it a fact or not? Here's the picture. They decide for themselves. But that's what I deal with.
So is it more than just when St. John's talking? Because I mean it's pretty obvious he talks about them running to the tomb and finding the linen cloths and the napkin that's covering his face. Are there other hints that St. John is dropping in the Gospels that people might not catch?
Oh, there's a lot going on there. You have to really to have a discussion about the Gospel of St. John. I have 6 chapters on the Gospel of St. John in the
About half
book.
the book. Yeah.
But that comes only after 10 chapters of forensics and so forth. So, in other words, you can't just jump into into Gospel of John without really going in through a lot of the forensics to get there. And it's and it's actually with the forensics that the things that I did discover that brought me into the Gospel of John, because I wasn't into the Gospel of John at all. But once I realized there were things going on, one of the things, of course, I think it's a basic thing and everybody knows about it and talks about it, is that every single blood mark that you see in the shroud is basically what John actually talks about in the gospel. If you're in forensics and you got a murder mystery and so forth, a murder situation, and well, a witness or the criminal himself will know how the murder took place and exactly what happened. And so that's what we have here. We have John. So everything that John says is on the shroud, and everything that's on the shroud is what John said. This is way beyond coincidence kind of thing.
Yeah.
And that fact that this is a real person, this really brings you to the edge and says, it looks very much like this man was there. You can't deny that. It's just the way it is. Those are facts that you're dealing with. You're not dealing with theory here, facts. And it's fascinating. But that was one of the reasons why I went to the Gospel of John, because I felt this man was a genius in the fact that he got all these things down, but he never talked about the image. And that's been a big question. Why hasn't John said anything about the image? People feel, well, it can't be the real thing because John hasn't said anything about an image. But the reality of it is this. If you then study and understand what was going on at that time, you have to go through the Jewish world. You can't go through the Catholic world to understand how John thought. You have to go into the Jewish world. And in the Jewish world, then and today even, with that to have an image of a man would have been that the shroud is would have been considered an object of idolatry, and even his countrymen would have taken that apart and ripped it up and thrown it into the Dead Sea. Josephus who's a historian that lived, and I did a lot of work on that. I was a historian that lived during the time of John, talks about that, about images. People would rather die than have these images around. So it's a very strong feeling. So there was no question that John could talk about it. He had to hide it. He had to conceal it, and it takes, and he did conceal it. And there's really enough data there to have us understand that indeed was the case. To try to get into that, I mean, people have to really sit down, read the book to understand. It was detective work. The whole thing was detective work. I spent 45 years as a detective. And that's what I wrote the book in that way. You just the detective work on the shroud itself, and then the detective work when you get into the Gospel of John.
Do you think the shroud played any part in the church allowing us to actually make images of Jesus? Right? Like, because that was a very big contention early on in church history. Like you have the commandment, make no image of me. And, it's in the commandments to make no image of God.
No
So do
graven
you think
image.
That's right. So you really, there's, no question. We have situations. People were, you go back. What happened was this: when I came back from Turin, I had this image, and I said, maybe this is a fake. I'm going to go to Harvard, and I went to see Ernst Kissinger. Now, Ernst Kissinger was a foremost student of the icons. In fact, he was right at the end of his life. He was ready to retire. He was starting to go blind. I went over to see him as a young man, okay? And I said, I want to find out the pictures or paintings that were done like the shroud. That was my attitude, okay? So he says to me, he said, look, he said, for the few of us experts around the world, the Shroud of Turin is really the shroud, we feel the Shroud of Constantinople. And of course, that's historic. Which we're not going to probably, we shouldn't really get into the history so much, but this is important. He said, I'll tell you, he said, the shroud is unique in the world. It doesn't fit into any artistic mode at all. Imagine this. I was a pure, unadulterated, absolute expert who spent an entire lifetime doing this. It doesn't fit into any category at all. He said, you can go and try to find something like that, but you won't. And he was right.
And especially from the time period they're claiming it's from, right? Like they're claiming it's a medieval forgery.
Well, that whole thing is nonsense. In fact, I remember I really pursued this in many ways. I went to see Macron out in Chicago personally. Okay. In fact, we were on a radio show at one point for 2 hours battling it out. Anyway, with Walter Macron. You've heard of Walter Macron. He's one of the guy that thought it was a fake. Okay. Back, you probably don't hear too much about him now, but that was big time in the past. And anyway, he brought a fellow on by the name of Nichols, and he's talked about the fact that this was medieval. Well, I came with the realization and the knowledge from Ernst Kissinger from Harvard that this doesn't fit in any category. And this fellow's saying, well, he's got long fingers and this and this and that, so this was obviously medieval. Well, he didn't know what he was talking about because it doesn't fit into any categories. So that's it. It's not a painting.
So from a forensic standpoint, do the nails go through his wrist or his hands? Because I've seen that debated.
Oh, gee, Barbet did a wonderful job. This is the first Barbet. I feel in a lot of ways Barbet was somewhat, as a young man, my mentor, even though he had died. I had met one of Monsieur Legrand. I met him and actually 3 times in my life. The last time I met him, he invited me to his home. He knew Barbet, and that was my connection with Barbet. It was really kind of fun. He was a grand old man, Monsieur Legrand. Anyway, it turns out that Barbet did wonderful work on this. First of all, and I like to give credit where it comes from, who did it. So Barbet, use cadavers. He put nails through the hands. The weight of the cadavers would tear through the flesh, and then he'd do it through the wrist, and like you see on the shroud, and that would it go through it would be going through the bony areas of the wrist, the bony area of the ear, and the ligaments and so forth. That was the place that held up the body. So that was it. The other thing that he did is that he lived in the 30s and 40s during the war and so forth, and he was a surgeon now. He had to amputate arms because that's what had to be done in those days, and the flesh of the arm would be still sort of alive, the nerves and so forth. They took that arm off. He would put a nail through the wrist, and at that time, that's when the thumb would go inside the hand. You end up with 4 fingers and no thumb, and you see that all the time. He did it every time he did it. That's what would happen. So the nail does go through the wrist. Okay, there's no question about it. There's no argument.
One of my
the point where you do not, you look at the facts and then you accept the facts as they are. You start arguing about things, you're going to waste your whole life.
No, I think people question it because at the times when you see the stigmata, whether it's Padre Pio or St. Francis, they usually get the stigmata in the palms of their hands, right?
Yeah, there's a certain, I don't know what that is, a certain psychology. In other words, they believe that that's where it is and that's where they get it. But, there's nothing wrong with that. That shouldn't have any effect. What they do is real. It's a real thing that happens. It happens to them. They believe that's where it's at. This is what happens. If it went somewhere else, it would be maybe very discouraging to them because they really have this sense. So I wouldn't connect the two. I don't think that's fair.
Okay.
One of my favorite kind of threads throughout your book is you describe very well how the transfer of blood to the shroud shows that this was a man who was crucified in the standard, position that the Romans crucified people in. But from some of the other blood and fluid transfers, we can tell that at least at some point, this man wrapped in the shroud was laying down. Yet you describe how the image of the shroud, using shadows and the way, if he was laying on his back, the body would have been squished. You describe how the image on the shroud itself was of an upright man, yet who had his feet crossed and could not be standing. Could you describe some of that a little and what you think the implications there are?
Sure. Thank you for bringing that on. Because I'm not sure how much time we have here. How much time do we have left?
We got time.
However much you want.
Yeah, if you don't have to leave, we're good.
Well, what it is the reality. I like to go back a little bit to get to bring you into how that all happened. And actually, I had done a lot of work on the blood marks and so forth, and the transfer of blood. And people have all kinds of theories on the transfer of blood, but there's a certain reality, and I wanted to bring that down to the real world so you could actually. What I have in the book, and I have the photographs of that as well, is that that you can once the blood has flown, the blood will clot, and it will remain moist for a period of time, from an hour to an hour and a half or whatever, so that which would allow the transfer of blood to cloth, and I've done experiments with regard to that, and it works. And those bloods, if you do experiments with people in the horizontal position, then that's one of the problems of some of the people that will say, well, it doesn't look like it or whatever. But the fact is, if it's horizontal, you get a different looking transfer. because serum collects. It's all on a flat surface. So it's the man died in the vertical position. So when the blood, it clots, that serum drains away, and you get a different, nice, neat clot, a nice, neat transfer. And so anyway, I did all that to show that it can happen. It's real. It's not something you have to imagine about it. A lot of people sort of think, well, those clots dried, and they dried so because there's they had to have dried because the man was taken from a crucified position, and if those blood marks were wet, they would be fragile, and they would have been, all over the place. But that piece of information alone, because I did a work on the Jewish burial customs as well, that if a man dies a violent death, I don't want to get into that, but mainly is that the Jews today or way back then, and I pressed that all the way back to the time of Jesus, through and use scholars and so forth to do that. And I have that also written down so it's one of the chapters of the book, is that when that blood is, excuse me, I need to get a little drink of water.
Yeah.
No problem.
Okay, when that, so when you make the transfer, I say it's moist. It has to be moist and whatever. Some people are saying that it's dried blood, and that it re-moistens and so forth. I tried to do that. It can be done, but there's a paper that just came out that says, well, it can be done if you have the right humidity and so forth. But there's only a big problem with that, because if you say that it's dried blood, you're taking a big step in doing that, because if it's dried blood, you'd have blood all over the place, because this man had blood all over his body. If you were with me in an emergency room, and I remember a young man coming in covered with blood. I can tell you everything, jacket, everything. And I said, my gosh, this man has quite a gash. It was from the head. Okay. I looked him over, and he just had a little tiny cut, very tiny cut at all. That's all it was. So you see the blood on the scalp is very, very, it's full of blood. I mean, that's one of the things. You wear a hat because a lot of blood goes to your scalp, and you want to wear a hat when it's cold outside because you want to just keep warm. That's the whole idea. So it turns out that he had blood all over his body. And if you have this, it's a theory. I would call it a theory that it happened because it was dried in the body, and then it re-moistened with humidity. Then you'd have blood everywhere. Okay,
Yeah.
You wouldn't have nice, neat clots. But what you have are nice, neat clots, and what that is, he had blood everywhere, and that blood dried. And then at the last part of his life, those were the last blood flows of his life that are moist. That's all that's moist. The rest of the blood on the body is dry. But those blood clots are moist, okay? And they are the ones that transfer to the cloth, period. If you try anything else, you're going to get blood from everywhere because he's full of blood.
Yeah.
You get my picture? It's a very important thing.
Yeah.
So, and the other thing is, well, they said that the blood doesn't smear. Well, you know what happens? And I time this. It takes just seconds to really soak up all the blood. In other words, once you put the cloth on the body and on a clot, I mean, that blood will soak right up there. Okay.
Yeah.
And by 10, 15, 20 seconds, by certainly by a minute, I mean, that's soaked into the cloth. It's done. And so if you then start to carry the body somewhere else, there's nothing to smear because all the blood is soaked up. It's all dried into it's there. And so that's why you don't have any smearing. You don't have any smearing of the clots because the Jews, and I'll say this again because it's very important, the Jews were very concerned about life's blood. And what we have on the shroud is Jesus's life's blood. The life's blood is a Jewish concept going all the way back to Jesus, and probably way before. Is that what happens? Is that the Jews were concerned. There was a controversy. I'll go back even further. There was a controversy back in the early '80s and before, since the shroud was first photographed. Since they found out that there was a hidden image of this man, people have been arguing about what happened. What they said, there were two camps. One camp said the body has the Jesus died in. Jesus died and he was buried according to the Jewish custom. The Jewish custom says that you have to wash the body. And so those people said, look, the body of this man has blood on it, so he can't be Jesus, but Jesus' body was buried according to the Jewish custom, and that's washing the body. So therefore, then the other camp said, well, there wasn't time to wash the body. We had no time because the Sabbath was imminent. Therefore, they just buried him almost according to the Jewish custom, but they didn't wash it. Well, in the investigation that I did, and I spent 1.5 years with my wife working on this, and we went to Harvard and everywhere else, and we realized we had to go back into the Jewish world to understand this. Okay, I even had I flew a fellow up from Washington D.C. Who had spent a lifetime, as a Jewish gentleman, whatever, and to help me to decipher all of this. And it turns out that what we discovered was that there's an exception to the rule of washing. The exception is that if a man dies a violent death, the blood is not washed off, because the Jews were and still are very concerned about the blood that's on the body with a violent death. What they do is they quantitate it and qualitate it. They qualitate it by saying that it has to happen. The blood that flows at the time of death is considered lifeblood. Okay, and the lifeblood being takes your life away, lifeblood, and that lifeblood there has to be, they quantitate it, has to be at least 1/4 of a log of blood. A log of blood is the contents of 6 eggs. 1/4 log of blood is the contents of 1.5 eggs, a small cup of wine. And you can see how far you can go with all of that. So that's considered lifeblood. And so what we have on Jesus is mingled blood. We have blood that poured out on him when he was alive, and blood that poured out at the time he died. That's called mingled blood. So when you look at the shroud, you're looking at Jesus's mingled blood, which is considered actually lifeblood. And lifeblood, according to the Jews at the time and so forth, was considered blood of atonement. Imagine blood.
Wow.
Okay, it's amazing. It's all in the book. Nice
Wow.
job.
Rob, do we have a couple of questions we can ask before we let Doctor go?
Well,
go?
I wanted to get
yeah, you want me to go a little further? I apologize because I just couldn't help myself in getting into that.
No, that was great.
Okay, so now what happened is that I learned a lot about what went on with regard to blood and so forth, and I was fascinated by the image, like everybody. And everybody said, "Well, that's the moment of the resurrection." That we see this image because of that. But I did not accept that, and I said to myself, "There's nothing on this cloth that convinces me, even though we have this marvelous image, that this is the moment of the resurrection. There's no fact that tells me that." Anyway, I was doing a work on the face, the blood on the face that I talked to you about, and I'll have to make this quick. I realized that when I was looking at the pictures, I took a picture of my colleague who was sitting at the dining room table, and I said, no, the man of the shroud is lying down. Lie down here. I took a picture of that man, and again, and then when the photographs came back, of course, in those days you had positive and negative photographs. So what happened was that I was very anxious to look at the photograph of the fellow. I took the negative of him, and when I looked at the negative of him, a bearded man lying down, I find it didn't look at all like the man of the shroud, the original negative on the cloth. And so I was again very disappointed, and I said, "Well, this is some kind of a fake or whatever." And I started looking, and then I started looking through the rest of my photos, and I came across the the same gentleman, but he was the picture that I took when he was at the dining room table, and I saw that the negative looked just like very much like the negative on the shroud, and that meant to me that because there were light areas around the eyes, under the nose, and so forth, that he was in the upright position. So he had these shadows, and when you're on the lying down, you don't have those shadows. In other words, we know that in generally in life, light comes from above, and you have shadows on your body, and everybody knows about that, especially in the art world and in the photography world. And so that was an awesome moment in my life, because I believe right in there, it was sort of my epiphany that I believe that indeed, because the man was upright, that it was that it was the moment of the resurrection. But I went back and I started looking at it some more, and I found more shadows under the pectoral muscles in the hands. And then I says, is there anything that goes along with that he's upright? And lo and behold, I said it was really like the elephant in the room. I looked at his hair, and I saw his hair really came down to his shoulders. And then I looked at the back, and the hair goes right down the back, just like the person that you would see upright. You see, I'm a physician, and I have people come in with long hair. I had people come in with long hair all the time, and I'd lay them down on the table, and I know exactly the hair would fall every single time. I don't care what hair they had, dirty hair, whatever, it falls down. And it flattens out, of course, when it hits the back. So now we had the hair of the man of the shroud that is consistent with an upright person, not somebody lying down. And then if I took you to an autopsy room, or a room where we did dissecting or whatever, I remember when I was in my 20s, when I first did a dissecting, I was so surprised when I turned the body over of the corpse, and there I found it all flat. The back was flat, not all flat, but very big, large areas of flatness, and the buttocks is flat. The lower legs are flat. If you go into a morgue or whatever, that's what you're going to find. Um, uh, gravity gravity just pushes down on the body and flattens it out. When you look at the back of the man of the shroud and compare it, and I have a lot of photographs in there. I even had a man lying on glass showing that whole thing, comparing the what the form of the body is when somebody's lying down to the form of the body when they're upright is entirely different. And on when you look at the shroud, the back of the shroud doesn't show you these large areas of gray, which they would if he had been lying down, but they actually show the form of a man who is upright. So that's when I came to realize that indeed uh, we have this compare. We have what we really have in summary is we have a man that was crucified. He was laid out on his back. The blood marks are absolutely consistent with that. But in contrast to those blood marks, there is the study of the anatomy and of the image itself. And we find that the image is not that of a man lying down, but a man who is upright. He's not standing, but he's actually, his feet are crossed. It looks like he's in midair. That's what we have.
Yeah. Yeah,
And
that's pretty wild. That's actually amazing. I tell you, my experience with the Shroud, it led to my conversion. So hearing this is just, it's so awesome.
Well, what it is that this led to me to believe that this was the moment of the resurrection. I have photographs in the book. You can look at them, make up your own mind. Everybody that I show these to, they can see it. There's no question that it's there, and you just look at it, make up your own mind. But it's there. So what I talk about, you can see. I don't deal with anything, only with facts, and deal with what's there. That's what brought me finally when I looked at this image, I said, why isn't he standing if he's resurrected? Why isn't he standing? And I didn't know what to do with that. And so I didn't know what to do with a man lifted up like that. That seemed to be lifted up, not standing. So that's what brought me to the Gospels. And then I said, maybe I'll find the answer in the Bible. So I went and I read Mark, Luke, and Matthew, and I didn't find anything. And then I went to John, chapter 12, verse 32, and Jesus says, "And I, when I'm lifted up when I'm lifted above the earth, will draw all people to myself." Lifted above the earth. I mean, he was giving me that actually what I was looking at on the shroud, lifted up above the earth. So I then the next statement actually said that he was talking about his crucifixion, but I have investigated that fully and properly through the proper, and I went to uh, people like Raymond Brown and other experts on the Gospel of John. And when Jesus talks about lifted up, he's talking about not only lifted up uh, uh, in, on the cross, but lifted up in resurrection and ascension back to the Father. And so, anyway, that's a whole new world that I got into, and I went to 2 years in graduate courses in studies on the Bible, and then study the Gospel of John intently for 10 years to do what I did.
That's
Well,
pretty
listen, you
amazing.
guys have been wonderful, and but everything's there in the in the book, the Shroud of Jesus, and you can get it anywhere. And
When did you actually write the book?
Um, well, it's really a culmination of all the work, a lot of the work that I did. Let me say that this is a process. Learning about this it took a lifetime, and it's a process. I've written other books before. In other words, that's putting together all the material that I put together over these 40 years, and and put it in the what I believe is in the proper perspective and understanding also with the Gospel of John. Gospel of John, you what it comes down to is you only partially know too much, know something. Let's put it this way: if we had the Shroud of Turin and we had no Gospels, it would just be an artifact sitting there, possibly a crucified man, and nobody would pay much attention to it. The reason why people pay any attention to it is because of the Gospels. And actually, it's more than that. You can only really understand the shroud uh, through uh, through the work and the words and the life of Jesus, which John's gospel does a beautiful job. The other three don't touch it at all, but
Mm.
John does, and that's obvious and you'll find that out when you read the book.
Well, John was at the foot of the cross and witnessed all of it. So, Rob, why don't we give a couple of the audience questions and we'll go from there.
Okay. Pete here wants to know if there's any indication of a shoulder wound on the shroud, and if so, is it on the right or left shoulder?
Okay, we're talking at the back. There's areas over on the back where he was scourged very badly, and we have areas on the back that show that that a heavy object was really placed on both the right and left portion of his back, like he was carrying something very heavy. The man of the shroud, which we believe this would be his cross, or part of his cross, the patibulum or whatever. So there are marks like that that show injury from weight. Okay.
Anything else?
Have we been able to determine a blood type or get DNA or anything like that from any of the blood clots left on the shroud?
Well, people have studied this and they come up with type AB, and AB is that's the least. I mean, as percentage, smaller percent of people have AB blood.
It's universal donor, also, right?
Yeah, yeah, it's a universal, right? Yeah, it's a receiver, isn't it? A universal Anyway, I haven't been into that. It's been a while, but I thought it was a universal receiver. But I'd have to go back and look at that.
When Lazarus was called out of the grave, Jesus said, "Untie him." Does the man of the shroud, does it show him also being tied with straps? I would imagine his wrists and his feet.
That could very well be. We don't. I can't. No one has come up, or I haven't seen, things that is areas on there to tell me that is the case. But that could very well be the case. That's something. I have no definite answer on that.
Okay. Well, Doctor, we are going to promote your book for you. We thought this is, so much information that I never knew before. That's so awesome. So, thank you for coming on with us. Thank you for your time. We're sorry we had those technical difficulties at the beginning of the show.
I want to say this, that I think you guys are great. I mean, to spend, the time you do and the dedication you have to bringing out the faith, I think that's wonderful. And I think you have a wonderful audience that listens and is interested and wants to expand their knowledge with regard to the faith. So I congratulate you, young men, for the kind of work that you're doing. God bless.
Thank you so much. Yeah,
Thank you.
That's a great compliment. Honestly, it's been a very interesting journey Rob and I have had for the past few months, even just doing this stuff, and we've learned a lot along the way. So we really do appreciate you coming on. If you write any other books, please reach out to us. Let us know. We'll have you back on.
Definitely.
Thank you very, very much for having me. It was a pleasure being with you. And again, sorry we had that little glitch at the beginning.
It's nothing. Don't worry about it. All right. Thank you so much, Dr. Lavoie.
Take care. Bye now.
You too. Goodbye.
We'll see you soon. Okay, so what do you want to do? You want to jump over to Rumble? We got a couple of funny videos and stuff.
Locals, you mean?
Yeah, locals. What did I say?
Rumble.
I actually have some funny things I sent you that we can do. We're only going to do like a half hour over there tonight because it's late already, but we'll do a half hour over there for everybody. So if anybody wants to join us, we're jumping over to locals.
I'm going to throw up the little outro video just because that helps me separate this stuff later on. So I'll throw that up and then I'll kill YouTube and we'll be over on locals.
All right. See you guys in a few.